and welcome to For the Record. Tonight, once again, we have joining us two distinguished guests. Mr. Sanaka Samarasinha joins us in studio. He is Fiji's UN Resident Coordinator. And joining us remotely once again is Mr. Satendra Prasad, Fiji's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations. The subject of our show this evening is climate change. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Zian.
Good evening, Zian.
The first question to you, Mr. Samarasinha. The COVID-19 pandemic is happening while the world is still fighting the challenge of climate change, and as our Prime Minister has pointed out earlier on, that Fiji is now fighting on two fronts. How has the pandemic affected progress on the climate change agenda?
Well, first of all, more broadly on the Sustainable Development Goals, I think we're going to see some real challenges. A recent UN report by the Economic and Social Commission in the Asia Pacific essentially said that the SIDS are not going to be able to achieve the SDGs by 2030, which is less than 10 years away, particularly because of the regression that we're seeing with respect to many of the goals post-pandemic. If you just take the economic impact, was Fiji and much of the Pacific has been quite successful in dealing with the health response Fiji for a whole year, whilst we are seeing some challenges now. The economic impact has been devastating, as we know, mostly because of the absence of tourism, but for other reasons as well. The SIDS in general have seen a GDP drop of around 9% last year in 2020. This is almost 3 times as much as it is in other developing countries in 2020. So in that kind of environment, economic environment, you might say, well, how are we going to achieve these SDGs? How are we going to achieve all of those goals related to the planet when we are really needing to help people eat and stay alive? And I think the answer to that is to understand that these are all interconnected. You know, I was in Liberia some years ago during the Ebola crisis for a short time, and one of the things we understood then is the connection between the loss of biodiversity and the virus. As we know, it came from a bat now.
Right.
Very likely that's also the case with respect to COVID-19. And so to look at climate, the planet on the one hand, and to look at lives of people on the other hand, it just makes no sense, right? So I think understanding that our future is actually protecting the planet as we protect ourselves is fundamental. Now, in the short term, I think that, you know, the UN Secretary General quite aptly called it a climate emergency, as you remember when he visited Fiji in 2019. But we are not taking it seriously. If you consider what's happening with COVID-19, everybody's talking about it, it's always on the news, and people are worried because they can see something happening right in front of their eyes. Climate change is as much of an emergency as COVID-19 is, except that it is not in front of your eyes every day, and it's not everywhere in the same way as COVID-19 is. We had 3 cyclones within a space of about a year here in Fiji, 2 of them category 5. But it was in Fiji. No, it wasn't everywhere else. And you'd say, well, why aren't people paying as much attention? So I think we really have to continue to pay much more attention. And there are a couple of specific actions I think we need to keep in mind. One, more so for countries that are the biggest, if you like, culprits of carbon emissions, and the UN's called for this. Coal is a huge problem, we know, And we really need to stop subsidizing those industries that are polluting our world and in the end killing us. On the other hand, it's also really important that we pay more attention to adaptation. Those countries like Fiji in the Pacific, who have done very little to create this climate emergency, are on the front lines of this disaster. And we really need to find a way to bring in resources to these countries that are on the front lines to help us adapt to climate change that's happening in front of our eyes as we speak. And I'm happy to say, through the UN system, we're doing a small part here in Fiji. In 2020 and 2021, about $30 million was being channeled in this area, much of it in terms of adaptation.
We'll be back after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Mr. Prasad, our next question is to you. One of the most devastating and serious effects of climate change is sea level rise, something that we specifically are vulnerable to. What is the region doing to address this?
Quite a few things. First, the answers lie partly in our hands, but in small measure, the answers lie beyond. And as Mr. Sanaka was saying, we need to work with the rest of the world to ensure that the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is hit. It's hit very soon, and we can hold on to the worst excesses of sea level rise. And that requires a number of things. So Fiji is working, you know that the Prime Minister leads the international charge on climate diplomacy very effectively, very powerfully, forcefully with the international community. He's talking very forcefully with the government of US, with Australia, with New Zealand, with the UK, and G7 countries, at the UN forums and at every forum that is available. Persistent, day in, day out. It's a message that is beginning to reach governments. It is beginning to reach people in the large polluting countries as well, who are in turn putting a lot of pressure on their countries. So that's the first. We need to have a global commitment, time-bound, very specific, where countries are making specific cuts, monitorable cuts in the greenhouse gases that brings us close to that brings us to the 1.5 degrees Celsius, and then the worst impacts of sea level rise can be avoided. If not on the trajectory we are today, where we might hit the 3 mark, most of the low-lying towns and cities in Fiji will be underwater or will no longer be habitable. Certainly my own hometown of Lambasa will be underwater, probably 2060, the current level of global warming. And any town or any settlement that is anything close to 1 meter above sea level will be exposed. So we're working day in, day out. This is our DNA. We do not have an option but to win the international case. We are looking with great determination to COP26 in Glasgow. We hope that our government will be able to participate in person in COP26, the health sort of restrictions allowing, and it will be a great moment at which we can bring much firmer action. There's some good outcomes that came out, for example, from G7 meeting that was held in UK only over the weekend, where clearer commitments were made by the top countries, and many of these, one important part of these commitments is that all countries, Fiji, but all countries, they need to bring their climate actions now. In this decade, we need to be making the cuts. Otherwise, it is too late. In 2030s and 2040s, it is too late to bring bring down the impact. Fiji is working the way in which we work with fellow smaller and developing countries who are most vulnerable, who are most exposed. We create larger groupings with like-minded developing countries, and then with like-minded developed countries as well, and try to raise the ambition and the pace of ambition as a consequence of that. It's a difficult journey, but we have to stay with it. We have to stay with it because we do not have an option to lose. And as Mr. Sanaka has said, and sorry to take a couple more minutes, the price we pay is too much. Cyclone Winston wiped off 30% of Fiji's GDP. It's probably it makes small world news, but if a similar size cyclone were to strike, were to have a similar scale damage on Australia, our closest large neighbor, it would wipe off something like $700 billion of its economy overnight. If Winston, with the same scale, had occurred in US, it would have wiped off $7 trillion equivalent of the economy. So, what we have to recover from each time is substantial. It is very large. It is something that many large countries cannot perhaps even fathom. Sorry to use a strong language, but we need to be very forceful, very direct if we are to win this battle of our lifetimes. And as Mr. Sanaka again said, last year demonstrates one of the worst things. Well, for most countries, COVID itself was the largest problem that they were dealing with. So it was for Fiji. But in exactly the same year, in a 14-month period, we went through 3 cyclones and 4 crises in the one calendar year, a couple of months more. This is both unjust. It is certainly unsustainable. And so the great focus of Fiji on our climate diplomacy and trying to secure an international consensus that gives us ambition, that gives us pace, that gets us very close to the 1.5 degrees Celsius in much shorter time frame.
Thank you for that, Mr. Prasad. We'll go to a break. When we come back, we'll carry on the discussion and especially Fiji's role in the lead up to COP26. Stay with us for that. Welcome back to the show. The discussion is on climate change, and Ambassador Satendra Prasad is also joining us remotely. Mr. Prasad, this question is to you. Fiji chairs Pacific Small Island Development States in New York. What is Fiji doing to take the lead to advocate for preparations towards COP26? And when you go to Glasgow, what are some of the key regional issues Pacific SIDS intend to take up to Glasgow?
Thank you. So one of the prime issues that Pacific and other small states have been saying is that the level of access that they have to finance through which they carry out adaptation, through which they respond to saltwater intrusion in agriculture and relocate communities and build better infrastructure and improve and schools can withstand 220 plus knot winds, etc. That it is about both access to finance, so that means that the volume of finance should be there, that is available on scale, and second, that they have the capacity or the systems are relatively smooth and fast, so that small countries with more limited capacities are able to access these pools of resources. This is crucial, this is fundamental, and we really hope that in Glasgow, the global North will live up to its commitment of 100 billion of climate finance per year, and that we would have walked through the system to also ensure that there's much speedier access to climate finance. That's second. As our Prime Minister has been articulating for so long, we need to move into the implementation of the Paris Agreement zone. And to move into the implementation, we need to complete the rule books, the rules and the procedures and the frameworks through which the Paris Agreement comes to life. So there's lots of outstanding discussions, and we need to nail them, and we are working through small states and lots of discussions and negotiations to try to reduce the areas of disagreement and hopefully get that over the line. And the third, which is very important for large ocean states like Fiji, is to see that there's a very significant blue component that is brought into the climate process. The oceans provide 30% of the planet's oxygen, for example. The oceans are a fantastic carbon sink. They absorb a lot of the carbon greenhouse gases. And we need to bring this more centrally, more directly into the climate process, so that countries are able to register what it is they're doing to make their oceans more sustainable, to bring their oceans, make the oceans more healthy, and ensuring that of coastal lines and mangroves and seagrass, that these are recognized in the climate process, and that countries are provided, like ours, are provided the incentives and the support, as well as technical know-how and capacity to help them manage their ocean resources in a planetary, very friendly way. These are all, some of them are technical discussions, some of them are political discussions. We have a great moment in Glasgow. There's a lot of energy, and we welcome the return of US into the Paris framework, and we hope that on all of these we will be able to clear the line and clear the bar and have a fantastic outcome for Fiji and small island states at the COP26 in Glasgow.
Mr. Prasad, if I can just follow that up with just a bit more on the blue aspect of the discussions, as you pointed out. So next year, the UN Oceans Conference takes place, and how do you see oceans becoming a major issue to be tackled within the UNFCCC process? If it does become a major issue, what are the pushbacks?
It is a major issue, so about that there's no disagreement. On pushback, there's substantial and significant pushbacks on bringing the oceans into the formal UNFCCC reporting process. But as Mr. Sanaka is saying, there's no, what is UNFCCC? What is UN? UN is us, all the countries put together. So at the end, all the countries put together have to agree to something, and you cannot, as a small state or as a large ocean state, we cannot have nuclear weapons or something like that to threaten large states to agree to what we are saying. We have to win them based on science, based on evidence, and this is what we're working towards. And the science and the evidence are very clear that we need to pay far more attention to oceans than we have done in the past. That if we win the climate argument on land, we might lose it in the oceans. Both of them have to work in sync, and that we need to be able to track and monitor what countries like Fiji and every other country are doing on oceans, on protection of mangroves and seagrass, of ensuring that the oceans are healthy, and that the transitions that need to be made are made. And one of the large transitions that also need to be made in the ocean space is about shipping, which contributes a pretty significant amount of the greenhouse gases. And these are all expensive and technologically difficult transitions for countries to be making, but nevertheless they all need to be done. It's one planet, so we need to win the argument based on the force of evidence, of science, on through that create the political will and momentum, so that all countries see that it is in the benefit of all of them. And even if you're a landlocked country such as Bhutan, that you are getting some of the oxygen that the ocean provides to you. So even for landlocked countries who don't have oceans, that they need to understand that they have a stake and they must share therefore the responsibility and obligation to protecting the world's ocean. So these are very important to lock in Glasgow and at the Oceans Conference in Portugal next year, when the whole UN family again gets together. We will be tracking and monitoring how far we have come in our SDG commitment on oceans, and what needs to be done to increase ambition, and how much further countries need to go, what are the types of levels of support that different countries might be facing to overcome the constraints, the difficulties. It will be but also as well, it will be a great moment to showcase the considerable progress, fantastic progress that not only Fiji, but so many countries are making now in the ocean space. They're having oceans laws, they're raising the bar on the ways and the levels at which oceans are being protected. Many countries are expanding significantly marine protected areas. And Kiribati to our north has a marine protected area of something like 500,000 square miles of the ocean. Phoenix Island Marine Protected Area. For many people, initially thought that as a consequence of that, their tuna fishing will decline. But what they found out, what the science found out, by protecting such large area of the ocean, they were able to actually catch more tuna on the areas just outside of the protected areas. So it will also be a great opportunity to show considerable progress countries are making, and that will certainly help lift the ambition much further.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Prasad. We'll go to a short break and we'll carry on the discussion when we come back. So stay with us for that. Welcome back to the show. Mr. Samara Sinha, we were talking earlier about how this pandemic has affected the ability of many countries to reach sustainable development goals as set out many years ago by 2030. So how can the UN assist SIDS, or rather, how can the UN assist small island developing states to achieve these goals by 2030?
We have in place something called the Volunteer National Review. It's a process by which all member states of the UN report to each other every 4 years or so on their progress towards achieving the SDGs. And I was there a couple of years ago with Ambassador Prasad, with the Honorable Attorney General, members of civil society in New York when Fiji presented the report. One of the things I think is important is for Fijians to really understand where are we in terms of achieving the SDGs, because the SDGs is about us. It's about our health, it's about our education, it's about protecting the space that we work in, our jobs, it's about protecting the space that we live in, our homes, our infrastructure, right? This is not some sort of academic exercise, and it's important for us to be involved and engaged. Now, I see, and when we talk about climate change, we talk about oceans, bureaucratic wheels don't turn as fast as we would like them to. And I think one of the brilliant things we've seen in the last few years is the emergence of young people as a force to reckon with. Because the world that we are using up through our consumption is the world that they're not going to have. And one of the things I'd really like to see more and more, already in Fiji we engage very closely with young people. In fact, one of the UN Secretary General's youth advisors on climate change, he's only got 7 around the world, happens to be a Fijian, was working in my office and is still part of the UN system. We need to make sure that these young voices are listened to, and so one of the things we will continue to do is to try to find platforms to project their passion. The second thing is that we really need to follow the science. That's one of the things we've learned in this pandemic, right? A lot of people may have a lot of opinions on a lot of different things, and they may cast all kinds of there may be skeptics and cast all kinds of doubt as to whether this is true or that is true. Let's get down to basics. Look at the science of what's happening in the world, whichever goal we are talking about, and let science dictate policy. But in order for that to happen, you also need data. And one of the areas, sadly, that's lacking in the small island developing states, especially in the Pacific, is data, is disaggregated data. And so if you look at the SDGs, it's not just the goal. We have targets and we have indicators under each goal. And it's really important to be able to have the ability to collect and analyze the data and then apply that analysis into how policies are made and how budgets are passed. So it's a whole process. And I think from the UN's point of view, what we'd like to see is renewed engagement. It's already happening, but we need to infuse even more energy into that whole process. What is the process? The process is the engagement of society, including some of those most passionate groups. People with disabilities, for example, I've seen through Pacific Disability Forum here and other groups, so much passion. The engagement of stakeholders, the collection, analysis, and application of data, the use of science to advance this agenda. And then finally, of course, is finance. And I've talked about this before, as you know, in your show the previous time I was here. The UN has to do more to be able to facilitate and unlock the finance that can come in to Fiji and countries like Fiji for the SDGs. So we need to be able to provide that analysis, that space to convene that. That's one of the things the UN does best, to convene the financiers, and not just other governments, not just international financial institutions, but the private sector. So once that happens, of course, then we'll have to make sure that we strengthen the ability of the government to channel those finances towards achieving SDGs.
Thank you for that, Mr. Samarasinha. Mr. Prasad, our next question is to you, and this relates to ocean biodiversity. So since the 1970s, as you're well aware, the world has seen a decline by 2/3 in ocean biodiversity. The Pacific region alone plays host to 476 globally threatened species. And if nothing is changed soon, this could be disastrous for us as well. What is Fiji, as a member of small island developing states, doing to advocate for biodiversity protection, particularly caused by climate change?
Thanks. Yeah. Several things. First of all, right now at the UN, the talks at a reasonably advanced levels on what is known as the BPNJ. This is a treaty for the regulation of biodiversity on the high seas, the seas that are beyond our jurisdiction. You know that lots of companies and many countries are already harvesting at very highly unsustainable level resources on the high seas, which are being used, marine organisms that are being used for marine genetics, for new medicine development, all sorts of things, from healthcare to beauty products and things like that. But to continue to harvest at scales and being not regulating this is a big risk, and the risk relatively also not known, because some of the science is not there, and we also do not fully understand the scale of some of these activities. So we hope that because of COVID, discussions on this have been delayed, but I do hope that by early part of next year, the United Nations, all the member states of the United Nations, will be able to agree to a treaty for the regulation of this type of resources on the highest seas beyond that. That's the first point. And things are looking in the right direction for Fiji and the Pacific and smaller states. We are saying we have a stake in this. We have a very important stake. These are activities that are being carried out just outside our waters that impact then on our own domestic resources, because fish and marine organisms do not stay in one place. They go with currents, they migrate, and the ecosystem operates in an interconnected manner. Second is that in a bit later in the year, in Kunming in China, again, the UN as a system will be gathered together for a biodiversity framework to agree to what should be the core elements, what should be the elements and the framework for biodiversity beyond this year. Lots of discussions, advanced discussions are taking place, and our Ministry for Environment and several other ministries are closely involved in this discussion. Some complex negotiations are taking place, and we hope that by the time all the member states are together at a high level, that we will be able to have a good, ambitious framework for protection of biodiversity, and that it will also include a commitment, a kind of a global commitment to protecting something like 30% of the oceanscape, of the ocean areas as well, as a part of this commitment for biodiversity protection on the framework will apply for both land and seas, but right now I'm talking about the sea component of it. Again, for countries like ours who have a stake, a very important stake in these things, we need to ensure that the bar is high, and that the treaty framework that eventually emerges is not porous, that it can be weakened from different sides, etc. And so we are taking a very ambitious sort of outlook, and we hope that there will be international consensus and countries will see that we're all in it together on this, because you may lose biodiversity, marine biodiversity in Fiji. We are at a loss immediately in Fiji, but the whole world is also losing out because of the way in which ecosystems are interconnected. The third part, but what I've already discussed with you, is that even if you protected biodiversity on land and on oceans, one important element of all of these things is that biodiversity is being impacted by warming seas and rising temperatures, and that is about climate change. So for this, we need to ensure that the climate, that our discussions in Glasgow fall in place, and that all countries are able to demonstrate very clear progress, as I said earlier, that they've brought their ambition much closer, and they're trying to achieve much higher targets by 2030, soon in this decade, so that the rising temperatures can be contained and the impact on biodiversity is reduced. So that's another part which I've already described to you. All of these three pieces put together give us a good shot, a very good shot. We need to take this. The international environment is positive, is trending positively, and I've said that US is return to the Paris frameworks is very exciting. It's got a lot of energy. The UK is leading excellently on the in the COP preparations. Italy is leading very well and setting their vision as well. China is leading excellently on the preparations for biodiversity meeting in Kunming, and the oceans preparations for the second oceans conference is also lining up with significant ambition, and a lot of progress is being made. It's a super year for nature, for biodiversity, if all of the pieces fall in place, we would have had our perhaps one best shot that may not be there for the next 20 years or so because of the way in which the stars have lined up. Fiji is very excited, and you've seen our Prime Minister leading the charge, talking about the super year of nature and how we want to bring things to a conclusion. We have to stop talking, get the agreements and the frameworks in place, and begin implementing and accounting for the implementation, showing the things that we have signed up for, we are delivering. So it's a very exciting year, a bit taxing at the same time when we are managing COVID, but it's our best shot we've had in a generation, and we need to take it and work with the international community to secure the planet, essentially, for future generations as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prasad. Mr. Samarasinha, we're just approaching the end of our show, and before we wrap up, we'd like to get some of your final thoughts and comments, especially in relation to Fiji's role. As our Prime Minister has always said, that Fiji has the habit of punching above its weight when it comes to its advocacy on the international arena. So just your final comments on how a small country like Fiji, with its limited resources, has contributed to the UN's mandate, and at the same time, some of the reforms that are happening within the UN as well at this point in time.
Well, Fiji has, from the very beginning, been an incredible member of the United Nations, and has been taking this journey with us for 50 plus years now, since its independence. I made a point in your previous show, I believe, about the role that Fijian peacekeepers have played around the world, and really something like 14,000 Fijian peacekeepers have served in so many different missions, helping to bring about a degree of peace, a degree of stability for people who need it most in these places that are ravaged by war and conflict. Sadly, some 65 Fijians have paid with their lives. And it's not only the soldiers, it's also the families who have to bear the consequences of their loved ones not being there. I have been there, having to take the remains of one of those brave souls, and it's heart-wrenching, you know, the kind of commitment and sacrifice that ordinary Fijians make for global peace. But it's not only in peacekeeping. We will celebrate that. We are actually doing an exciting initiative now to put together a book and a documentary movie on memoirs of peacekeepers, from your president and prime minister, people like Mr. Rambuka and a whole range of others, but also, you know, very ordinary people who you may not know, who have extraordinary stories to tell. So I'm looking forward to that initiative coming to some sort of fruition in the coming months. Fiji has, of course, been a huge champion of climate change. And in fact, speaking of champions, I was able to hand over the UN's Champion of the Earth Award last December to your Prime Minister. And that is a recognition of the UN for all of the work that the Prime Minister has done before COP, during your leadership in COP, and continuing on now. The UN's envoy, you were talking about oceans, the UN's Secretary General's envoy on oceans, in fact, is your former ambassador, Peter Thompson, and he's a very passionate advocate for the preservation and protection of oceans. Similarly, I think, you know, Fiji's really, through Ambassador Prasad's efforts, I've seen it firsthand, put not only the issues that Fiji wants on the table, but on behalf of the Pacific SIDS, made so many strides within the UN system. Ambassador Nazat in Geneva is the president of the Human Rights Council and is making great strides on a whole range of human rights issues, amongst other things, climate justice, which is so important to the SIDS. I think this is also a good time for the SIDS. I'm so happy also to see my old friend who has just been elected as the president of the UN General Assembly, the foreign minister of the Maldives. So the SIDS and Fiji in particular are making great contributions, and that's one of the nice things about the UN. Doesn't matter how big or small you are equal. And what I think small countries like Fiji have come to realize is by banding together as the Pacific SIDS or as the Caribbean SIDS or together as SIDS, you really have quite a lot of leverage within the international community, and I can see that they are using it more and more effectively, and I really look forward to that. And then finally, just to wrap up in terms of the UN itself, look, again, the UN really belongs to all of us. And at the end of the day, as much as the Secretary General is leading, as much as the bureaucracy is trying to change, reform is not going to happen unless the people who own the organization, in this case the shareholders, I would say, of the UN, actually makes a change happen. And so it's really important for the member states to push that reform forward. And it's important for the people who live in those member states to push their representatives to also make that change happen in the UN. And ultimately, I do foresee that this is an organization that not only belongs to us, but also belongs to future generations, because it is what was set up to do. It is to protect the people and the planet, not only for this generation, but for generations to come.
Thank you for that, Mr. Samarasinha. Unfortunately, with that, we've reached the end of our show. We thank you once again for the very fruitful discussions that we had last week on Fiji's support that's been given by the UN in relation to COVID-19 and managing this pandemic, and tonight's discussion on climate change. Thank you very much. And to Mr. Prasad as well, who joined us remotely. Mr. Prasad, we wish you all the best, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And that's all we have for you on the show tonight. Have a good evening. Stay safe.